Our perception of what happened on September 11th is very different from the general public's perception, I'd say, for the most part. There are people in the public that know more, there's different levels of what people know and have spent the time to uncover, but it's a very convoluted story, so it takes a lot of effort to really understand what happened on September 11th and post-September 11th.
I believe that the public is still uninformed about most of the issues that are surrounding 9/11. I think that they still believe in the myth that there was nothing that we could do about it, that we were caught unaware, and that today we would be better prepared.
I still don't think to this day, 4 years later, that I have come to terms with how September 11th happened, why it happened, and who actually perpetrated the crimes of that day.
I think the truth sometimes can be frightening. And unfortunately, what we've been through is so devastating that searching for the truth and finding out exactly what happened is not frightening.
I just don't think the public at all knows. They want to believe that our country does the right thing, and I just don't think people want to go there. And that's why they don't have the information, because they don't want it.
So from the very start, we were misled. There was misinformation being fed to the public and disinformation. And a lot of those things didn't really ever get cleared up in the minds of the public. The first things that you hear a lot of times remain in your mind, and it's hard to undo those very first impressions that were given to the public by the government, by the administration about 9/11. And since then, that remains true. We do not know the whole story about what happened on September 11th at all.
The government has one, theory about how things went, and then there are so many others. And if you just lay the facts bare as to who is where, when they heard what, there's so many conflicts that to date I don't think that I have received the truth from any one source.
One of the things that discouraged me and upset me a great deal early on in the early days post 9/11, I wouldn't say early days because we were on the floor, but in the early months, as I started to come out of my fog and started asking some questions which I thought were valid, I was surprised that no one else was asking the questions, including the media, most especially the media.
I really, truly believe there are people in the media that want the truth. But the problem is, and again, you'll get sound bites in the Washington Post, USA Today. But I don't think there's a newspaper around that's going to allow a reporter to take the ball and run with it. And I truly believe there's a lot of people that want these answers. But the thing is, a guy just can't spend the next 6 months and not collect a paycheck. So if the paper's not going to give him that paycheck, he's not going to get the information. And that's the problem.
They don't have the time to do the investigation that they should. They are fed press releases from the White House, and they go out with that, and they don't question it, and they don't take it any further. And you know what? If you are a population that doesn't have all the information, then you are not a people that are governed by the people.
And I think some journalists are braver than others to go into areas that perhaps might be viewed as unpopular by the administration. And to them, we raise a glass and toast them, because that's what's supposed to happen in the Fourth Estate. It's supposed to be that their job is to give us the truth so that we can function as an informed citizenry and a democracy.
When we started questioning what actually happened on that day, what should have happened on that day based on information we had gleaned from reports and even earlier mainstream articles on how other incidents were handled with regard to counterterrorism, we found all these other protocols and procedures about what happens when a plane goes off its course wildly, as we know happened on September 11th.
Senator Day.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman, I want to say again to you that we are all indebted to you and to the other 8 members of your commission and your staff. It is a profoundly disturbing report because it chronicles in excruciating detail the terrible attack against our homeland, and because of the utter failure to defend them by their federal government, by their leaders and the institutions that were entrusted to do so. And this was not an occasional human error or failure. This was nothing but human error and failure to follow established procedures and to use common sense.
If a plane goes off course, it's a danger to the other planes that are in the sky. So there are protocols in place that if there's no radio, they can't contact the plane for a certain amount of time, or the plane goes terribly off course, that we will send up a military jet to intercept it so as to bring that plane back on course.
What we needed were Air Force intercepts sent to investigate why the planes were off course, why their transponders had been turned off. We didn't need a shoot down at that moment. We needed to know who was in that plane, why was it off course, and then follow a series of protocols and procedures from there.
So when we looked at the timeline for September 11th, and there was no intercepts on September 11th, we could never understand how that could not have happened and why, if it didn't, you wouldn't go back to those people and say, what went wrong here?
According to your report, the first of the 4 airliner hijackings occurred on September 11th at 8:14 a.m. Eastern Time. At 10:03 a.m., almost 2 hours later, an hour and 49 minutes to be exact, the 4th and last plane crashed before reaching its intended target. During those entire 109 minutes, to my reading of your report, this country and its citizens were completely undefended.
We started to hear that they knew that Flight 11, the first flight that hit my husband's building, American Airlines Flight 11, was a known hijacking somewhere around 8:20 in the morning.
For 30 minutes before it hit the World Trade Center, controllers in Boston and New York had been tracking and listening to the first hijacked plane, American Flight 11.
At 8:37 and 52 seconds, Boston Center reached NEADS. This was the first notification received by the military at any level that American 11 had been hijacked.
We have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need you guys we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise?
No, this is not an exercise, not a test.
There were 2 F-16s from the 177th Fighter Wing in Atlantic City, Air National Guard unit, doing bomb sorties over the pinelands of New Jersey, 8 minutes away from Manhattan. And they admit in the report today that they contacted Atlantic City, but they said they were basically inactive. So you had 2 F-16s 8 minutes away that could have stopped, potentially thwarted AA-11, not to mention the second flight. So what about that?
These were planes were not thought to be errant. They were known to be hijacked quite early on.
Mike Blake is an air traffic controller at the Boston Center.
American 11 had stated on the frequency that we have more planes.
In fact, controllers knew a second plane, United 175, was right behind the first one and notified top officials.
When you started looking at how could that plane be flying around the skies as a hijacking and then hit a building, and then have a second plane hit a second building at 9:03, and then have the Pentagon, which is supposed to be our country's defense, get hit at 9:40 or 9:38 with a third plane, and then have the final plane go down in Pennsylvania at 10:03 or 10:06.
Victoria, let's talk a moment about American Flight 77, evading detection for some 36 minutes. Is there any rational explanation for that?
You need to understand at the time, and I was in the middle of this, at the time there were literally thousands of airplanes in the skies over the United States. And many, many parts of the federal government, including the FAA and NORAD and others, were focused on trying to get those planes on the ground. There were lots of false signals out there. There were false hijack swats, and a great part of the challenge was sorting through what was a legitimate threat and what wasn't.
Is that defensible, Peter?
Indefensible. There's the greatest failure of defense in American history.
But what I find much more shocking were the repeated and catastrophic failures of the leaders in charge and the other people responsible to do their jobs. And then they failed to tell us the truth later. It doesn't matter whether they were Republicans, Democrats, or neither. It matters what they did or did not do.
At some point, we went back to look at where each of these gentlemen were and why they didn't respond. I don't know, even just respond in some appropriate, high-level manner.
The chain of command in the event of a hijacking calls for the President to empower the Secretary of Defense to send up military aircraft and, if necessary, give an order to shoot down the plane.
The point is, he had the sole ability to order the shoot down of the planes, and the Otis Air Force Base pilots, Duffy and Nash, said we didn't have the authority, and even if they had gotten there in time, without that authority from the President, so that POTUS is out of the loop.
I had a huge issue with the leadership that day, okay? It was really hard for me to understand that the President was unaware and at a school, that Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, was at his desk until the Pentagon was hit.
The Secret Service has an arrangement with the FAA. They had open lines after the World Trade Center.
Tracking it by radar.
Supposedly at 8:46, the FAA set up a phone bridge with the Secret Service, with NORAD.
Well, if the FAA opened a phone link after the first tower was hit, they would have known that it wasn't a little plane. Then it wasn't an accident.
Simultaneously, the pagers of his aides erupt in a cacophony of beeps and tones.
He goes into the school. Carl Rove and I and some others were standing there and informed him of this, in which he, being a former pilot, had kind of the same reaction going. Was it bad weather? And I said, no, apparently not.
The President was surprised. He thought it had to be an accident.
With the Secret Service in on that at 8:46 in the morning, they would have also, by standard protocol and procedure, had to have told the National Security Advisor, who was also, is also there in protection of the President. She is to inform him of all national security threats.
The President ducks into an empty classroom and calls National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice back in Washington.
He said, that sounds like a terrible accident, keep me informed.
It, again, seems impossible that she was not aware of the terrorist attacks, the fact that these were hijacked planes. These were not errant planes or pilot error.
At that same moment, 3 blocks from the White House at the St. Regis Hotel, 2 old friends meet for breakfast at a window table. George Tenet is the Director of Central Intelligence. His companion this morning is David Boren, the former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
And out of the corner of my eye, I could see several people converging on our table. And I remember one of them said to George Tenet, Mr. Director, the World Trade Tower has just been attacked by an airplane. I was struck by the fact he used the word attacked.
His instincts are to think this is not an accident, but nobody knows, and it's a very cautious internal White House reaction.
well, first of all, if he knew that the first tower was hit and then still went into the classroom and sat there, that's outrageous. At 8:46, they would have known that something serious was going on and should have responded immediately. At the second tower, where my husband was hit at 9:02. That is plenty of time to send out a warning and get the people out. And that is plenty of time to send up an intercept. And why that was not done, if they were all on this phone bridge and everybody knew what was going on, is beyond me. Why Bush continued to go to the classroom and put the kids at risk is beyond me.
The Chief of Staff, Andrew Card, approaches from his right, leans down, and says the following words. "A second plane has hit the second tower." And with those words, the President now understands the war on terrorism has begun.
The country was clearly under attack. I mean, I was petrified.
The commander-in-chief, let's put a commander, as soon as he heard 906, the nation's under attack, we know that there were Marines and Secret Service people going, are we ready to go?
He's in Sarasota, Florida.
And I know, but I mean, he could have made it to Air Force One if he was going to do a press conference to reassure the nation. He could have done it aboard the plane.
But the president remained in the classroom for at least 5 more minutes.
10 more, actually. In the classroom, and then he stayed in the school in which he prepared a press statement, and they actually did a press conference from the school.
Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country.
Now, keep in mind that at this point, as many as 11 planes, there was a suspect that were hijacked. They have no idea where these other planes are going. The president is a highly visible target.
At the same time, Vice President Cheney, at the White House, watched on television as a second plane struck the World Trade Center.
Watching developments on television, and as we started to get organized to figure out what to do, my Secret Service agents came in. And they, under these circumstances, they just move. They don't say, sir, or ask politely. They came in and said, sir, we have to leave immediately.
He claims to have only heard the attacks at 9:30 when the Secret Service came in and said that the nation's under attack and that he had to be put in someplace safe.
And when it entered the danger zone, it looked like it was headed for the White House, was when they grabbed me and evacuated me to the basement.
And yet there are photographer accounts and Richard Clark's account that, in fact, Vice President Cheney was informed around 9 o'clock. Why didn't Vice President Cheney then ensure that the right steps were being taken by the Department of Defense? Why wouldn't they then evacuate perhaps D.C. buildings? There was a whole chain of events. I mean, maybe the Pentagon wouldn't have, or maybe it would have gotten hit, but maybe not as many people would have lost their lives. How is it that the Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, the then acting Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Myers, were totally unaware then, after this chain of command is interrupted, why they then weren't activated in some way, shape, or form to at least protect the president, protect the vice president.
At Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington, fighters were scrambled outside the military chain of command because the Secret Service requested them to protect the White House.
And I'd like to ask Victoria if you were working with Secretary Rumsfeld at the time?
Yes.
Okay, now there are 2 stories about Secretary Rumsfeld.
We find that, according to his accounts, that he was unaware of the attacks until the Pentagon got hit. And then apparently he rushes out to help victims of the attack.
Richard Clark, in his book, Against All Enemies, says that a teleconferencing session was set up at the White House at about 9:10. Present in this teleconference were the CIA director, the FBI director, Secretary Rumsfeld, Condi Rice, Richard Armitage representing Colin Powell.
Here we have 2 totally different accounts. This is not a partisanship issue. This is something that if you pulled the tape, you know, we could have nailed the facts right then and there, who was there and who was not there.
So where was he?
Where was the SecDef?
First thing that morning, as a matter of fact, he was meeting with members of Congress. He was having breakfast with meetings with members of Congress. And what he was talking about was the world in which we found ourselves has changed dramatically. And it was much less likely that we were going to face armies and navies and air forces going forward.
Tori, was he a part of this teleconference or not?
Let me finish. Let me finish. He was having a conversation with them about exactly the fact that the world had changed and we hadn't changed with it.
So
now let me tell you what happened that morning.
We have to do it quickly.
He was meeting with the members of Congress when the planes hit the World Trade Center. The communications center immediately starts spinning up. He was part of it. I was in another part of the building when the plane hit the Pentagon. He goes to his outer office and says, what was it? Immediately, people didn't know. So his instincts, which are very good, said, find out exactly what happened.
Among those helping the wounded and injured is the 69-year-old Rumsfeld himself. The Secretary of Defense is outside the burning building, while inside the Pentagon.
For 30 minutes, we couldn't find him. And just as we began to worry, he walked into the door of the National Military Command Center.
Fair enough, but why didn't he go to the war room? He's the Secretary of Defense. Why didn't he go into the war room and take command in the Pentagon? He didn't show up for over an hour and a half after the first plane was hijacked. Why? The Secretary of Defense.
General Myers, who was the acting Joint Chief of Staff that day because the Joint Chief of Staff was flying, was also, he was in a meeting with Max Cleland going over his confirmation hearings for the next day and said that he was, you know, unaware until the Pentagon hit.
On 9/11, General Richard Myers steps in as acting chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
It was, from my viewpoint, a very professional scene. There was no panic, no undue alarm.
And the reason why I feel that it's important is because I want to make sure that people who are supposed to inform my leadership are doing their jobs. I want to make sure that everybody knows what the protocol is so that in an emergency, we don't have an hour of people doing nothing.
Late today, Pentagon sources told CBS's Bob Orr that contrary to early reports, U.S. Air Force jets did get into the air on Tuesday while the attacks were underway. Bob, what can you tell us about that?
Well, Dan, we do now know tonight as the terrorist attack was unfolding on Tuesday, the U.S. military scrambled fighter jets in a desperate attempt to intervene.
At 8:44, two F-15s received a scramble order at Otis Air Force Base on Cape Cod. But 2 minutes later, at 8:46, American Airlines Flight 11, the first hijacked jet, slammed into the World Trade Center.
Yet 1 week after 9/11, in response to initial reports that the military failed to defend our domestic airspace during the hijacks, NORAD issued an official chronology which stated that the FAA notified NORAD of the second hijacking at 8:43. Wrong. FAA notified NORAD of the third hijacking at 9:24, according to your report. Wrong. FAA notified NORAD of the fourth hijacking at an unspecified time, and that prior to the crash in Pennsylvania, Langley F-16 Combat Air Patrol planes were in place, remaining in place to protect Washington, D.C. All untrue. In public testimony, before your 9/11 Commission in May of 2003, NORAD officials stated, I assume under oath, that at 9:16 they had received the hijack notification of United Flight 93 from the FAA, that hijacking did not occur until 9:28. There was a routine cockpit transmission recovered at 9:27. And in that testimony before you, NORAD officials stated also that at 9:24 they received notice of the hijacking of the third plane, American Flight 77. Also untrue according to your report.
The 9/11 Commission is expected to release its final report next month, but today's presentation, called a staff statement, was dramatic and powerful. It focused on how the federal government reacted to the hijackings on 9/11. Today's statement also included a detailed timeline.
I mean, NORAD stood up at the first hearing and had a chart which listed how many minutes, you know, that they were informed of something, which totally changed. Not one place in the media did I see them go into, what do you mean? How did NORAD come to the first hearings and the FAA with timelines that were not true? You know, why would that happen? And I don't remember anybody in the media following up on the delay in intercept time. I remember them taking whatever the commission said as fact.
Yet NORAD's public chronology on 9/18/01 and their commission testimony 20 months later covered up those truths. They lied to the American people, they lied to Congress, and they lied to your 9/11 Commission to create a false impression of competence, communication, coordination, and protection of the American people. And we can set up all of the oversight possible at great additional cost to the American taxpayers, and it won't be worth an Enron pension if the people responsible lie to us. If they take their records and doctor them into falsehoods, and if they get away with it. Because for almost 3 years now, NORAD officials and FAA officials have been able to hide their critical failures that left this country defenseless during 2 of the worst hours in our history. And I believe that President Bush must call those responsible for those representations to account. If the Commission's accounts are correct, he should fire whoever at FAA, at NORAD, or anywhere else betrayed their public trust by not telling us the truth. And then he should clear up a few discrepancies of his own.
We were told that the FBI and the CIA were pretty much clueless about what was coming down the pike on September 11th, but on the day of September 11th, they knew it was bin Laden right away, they knew that there were 19 hijackers right away, they knew that it was Al-Qaeda right away. You know, I don't know how they so quickly, you know, after being so incredibly clueless, were able to just, you know, find all these dots and connect them.
Today, the FBI is releasing photographs of 19 individuals believed to be the hijackers aboard the 4 airliners that crashed on September 11th.
These are the faces of those who carried out the 4 attacks. And over the past week, the FBI have been trying to piece together how they lived, where, and with whom.
My first question was, I think immediately, where did they get the pictures of the hijackers that day, the following day after 9/11? I said, that's fishy.
Within 48 hours of the attack, you have the FBI being able to name, photograph the 19 hijackers and know exactly who performed, you know, these atrocious attacks on the United States of America.
If the FBI works that quickly, I commend them, and I think that's wonderful. However, if you were able to get those 19 pictures up so rapidly, what the hell were you doing on September 10th? They had to be somewhere in your database. They had to cause concern somewhere if you got them that quickly. So where the hell were you in the weeks leading up to?
So we went to Director Mueller and we asked them, we had maybe 3 meetings.
Kristen, Lori, and as Peaceful Tomorrow's people, 2 of us went down there just on our initiative. Beverly was there. So there was approximately 10 people there.
And like most meetings that we had, they tended to get contentious because what you'd have is the agency heads saying they either had no answer, they didn't know, that was a rumor, every excuse but an answer.
And he spent most of the time talking about what they have done with their computers since. You know, more or less saying, well, it was a tremendous computer failure.
As far as the Pent Bomb investigation, you know, it was, they explained to us what the origin of the word Pent Bomb, I think, is investigation, and Pent is Pentagon, and the Twin Towers is the 2 T's in the Pent Bomb. That took up some of the time.
So we had to sit and listen to that song and dance for about, I'd say, a good solid hour. And then we started asking them questions.
I remember hearing reports of the hijackers that were listed on the FBI 19 were showing up, you know, in places alive.
Last week, the FBI, having gathered evidence, confidently issued the 19 names of those who had seized the 4 planes. Many of them were from Saudi Arabia. Now it appears that some people with those names are still alive. The FBI is working on the possibility that the hijackers used stolen identities. All of this complicates linking the attacks to Osama bin Laden.
Take the case of these 3 men. Is this really Abdulaziz Al-Umari, the man in the airport picture? Not according to one Arabic newspaper who says it's spoken to a Mr. Al-Umari in Saudi Arabia. Then there's Walid Al-Shahri, another man named as a hijacker, but whose father says now lives in Morocco. And finally, there's also doubt about Khalid Al-Midar. Officials are thought to be looking at the possibility the name may have been an alias.
We asked Director Mueller, what's going on here? We hear that some of these people are actually, you know, not who they were supposed to be. We're using aliases, we're using false identities. How can you continue to say that they were on the plane and that they're dead? Aren't you looking into what, you know, who really was responsible here?
How many of the 19 are you certain of? Can you say that you're certain of the identities, that they did not pick up false identities of any of the 19?
Well, I think we are fairly certain on a number of them.
If they were good questions, a lot of times we were told it had to do with national security. They couldn't tell us. So if it had to do with, you know, it had to do with the Moussaoui trial, so they couldn't address the questions.
And to get the standard polito-speak from everyone at these meetings was frustrating. And inevitably, someone would start banging the table. Someone would raise their voice.
And I truly lost my temper. I just said, what is this crap that you're talking about? And we brought up the put options.
Federal officials have begun a major investigation into whether someone or many people benefited financially from the evil done to the country last Tuesday. Not long before the attacks occurred, there were some financial transactions in the stock market that may indicate knowledge of the attack before it began.
The week prior to 9/11, there were puts on the airlines. And it wasn't just all the airlines, it was on American and United, which meant you were betting that those airlines' stock prices would go down.
The trades are called puts, and they involved at least 450,000 shares of American. But what raised the red flag is more than 80% of the orders were puts, far outnumbering call options, those betting the stock would rise. Sources say they've never seen that kind of imbalance before. After the terrorist attacks, American Airlines stock price obviously did fall. And according to our sources, that translated into well over $5 million total profit for the person or persons who bet the stock would fall.
One example, United Airlines. The Thursday before the attack, more than 2,000 contracts betting that the stock would go down were purchased, 90 times more in one day than in 3 weeks. When the markets reopened, United stock dropped. The price of the contracts soared, and someone may have made a lot of money fast.
$180,000 turns into $2.4 million when that plane hits the World Trade Center.
Altogether, at least 7 countries are dissecting suspicious trades that may have netted more than $100 million in profits.
And there's much more, including an extraordinarily high number of bets against Morgan Stanley and Marsh & McLennan, 2 of the World Trade Center's biggest tenants.
Merrill Lynch was involved, and I said, Merrill Lynch's stock was 48 the day before 9/11, and I said the next day it was down to 41. This is kind of fishy. I said, suddenly, you have these 2 major airlines, and their stock go down, they go down tremendously, and somebody's making lots of money off of 9/11.
And the answer that we got was, we've investigated and we find no unusual trading activity.
Could this be a coincidence? This would be one of the most extraordinary coincidences in the history of mankind if it was a coincidence.
It is absolutely unprecedented to see cases of insider trading covering the entire world, from Japan to the United States and North America to Europe.
So we said, well, you know what? What would make me feel better is tell the story.
Can you follow up on that? Can you tell us, can you be more specific? Can you pull up the trades? Can you, show us what really happened?
Who did those trades? Based on what research did they have that just those 2 airlines? And where is the money, and did it get dispersed?
Investigators now believe that in this climate, even the most secretive banks will hand over information to expose the most devious kind of insider trading. Sources say U.S. investigators are making headway in tracking down suspicious stock trades made just before the attacks.
We can directly work backwards from the trade on the floor at the Chicago Board's Option Exchange. That trader is linked to a brokerage firm. That brokerage firm received the order to buy that put option from either someone within their own brokerage firm speculating or from one of their customers.
Do we know who performed those trades? Yes. Can we have that information? No.
And he said, well, this is disinformation. I said, what are you talking about, disinformation? We know this happened. And then he dropped it, and he just drops it, just like that.
Well, you're asking me to go on faith that, that's the truth. Hard to go on faith when I feel that I've been failed and not told the truth.
They weren't really forthcoming and truthful with us.
And you'd leave there as frustrated as you left every other meeting. And, this was meeting after meeting, it didn't matter with who. One of the first things we had to combat was the stories that were out there and still are out there that 19 Islamic fundamentalists hijacked 4 planes, managed to do it, kill 3,000 people, end of story. And the blame does not end at the feet of the terrorists. Yes, they did this, but they were able to bypass every security measure that we had in place.
We asked this one agent whether they were, following any of the terrorists, and he said definitively no.
Only 2 of the 19 individuals that have now been identified were even known to the U.S. intelligence community. The FBI was looking for them but had no authority to arrest them because they hadn't done anything illegal at the time.
The joint inquiry report had not been completed, but on the day of its release, shortly after we've had this meeting with the FBI, that is when we learned that there were 14 open investigations on some of these terrorists. And that if you go through the records, even in the joint inquiries report, I think there were like 7 different instances at least where the CIA was tracking some of the terrorists and did not inform the FBI.
Look,
get passed on to the FAA.
the question that we always had in this August 6 PDB was that it says here that nevertheless, FBI information since that time indicates patterns of suspicious activity in this country consistent with preparation for hijackings or other types of attacks. We didn't know what patterns they were talking about. What were patterns? That means more than one.
It's pretty stunning when you learn that the CIA did indeed know about two of the hijackers more than a year and a half before the event. Knew that that one of them was in the country and the other one had a multiple entry visa to enter the country.
In Washington, the CIA and FBI had joined forces and established a special bin Laden room at CIA headquarters. The CIA was also tracking bin Laden associates, who they believed had set up cells or operating units around the world.
They learned that suspected terrorists will travel to Malaysia in early January 2000.
Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi. I mean, these were two hijackers that went to Malaysia for an al-Qaeda summit in January 2000. The CIA learned about this meeting. It arranged for it to be under surveillance by the Malaysian Special Branch. It had photographs of the suspected al-Qaeda operatives gathering and meeting.
Malaysian intelligence catches the men on camera and sends the surveillance to CIA headquarters. The spies identify Khalid al-Mihdhar and learn that Nawaf al-Hazmi is traveling with him.
It subsequently learned within days that two of them, al-Mihdhar and al-Hazmi, were headed for the United States. One, in fact, had entered and the other had a multiple entry visa, al-Mihdhar.
The CIA obtains a photocopy of Mihdhar's Saudi passport and discovers he has a U.S. visa. It was considered interesting. The head of the agency's counterterrorism team will tell the commission,
the story gets even more incredible. Number one, it doesn't alert any other government agencies to the presence of these two hijackers in the United States. It doesn't tell the FBI, which is responsible for tracking terrorists in the United States.
Not only were al-Mihdhar and al-Hazmi at the meeting in Kuala Lumpur in January of 2000, in March of 2000, officials now confirm another nation told the CIA that al-Hazmi had flown from the Malaysian meeting to Los Angeles, California.
My question is, do you know why the FBI was not notified of the fact that an al-Qaeda operative now was known in March of the year 2000 to have entered the United States? Why did the CIA not specifically notify the FBI?
Sir, if we weren't aware of it, when it came into headquarters, we couldn't have notified them. Nobody read that cable in the March timeframe.
Nobody read it.
To me, the most eyebrow-raising detail I didn't learn until the Justice Department Inspector General's report came out just a few months ago. A FBI detailee who knew about this at the Counterterrorism Center at the CIA actually had drafted a cable to alert the FBI, his colleagues at the FBI, to the presence of, or the possible presence of Khalid al-Mihdhar, suspected al-Qaeda operative, having entered the United States, and that cable was squashed by superiors at the CIA. They did not pass it along.
In October 2000 came the attack on the USS Cole in Yemen. Then in January 2001, officials now say, the FBI identified a third man who attended that meeting in Kuala Lumpur, Tawfiq Atash Khalid, as a suspect in the Cole bombing. At that point, the CIA could have put al-Mihdhar and al-Hazmi and all others who attended the meeting in Malaysia on a watch list to be kept out of the U.S. It was not done. On July 4th, al-Mihdhar was able to re-enter the U.S. from a trip outside the country.
You know, these hijackers played a critical role. They intersected with almost all the other members of the plot, and the CIA never passed along the information. They never did anything that would have allowed U.S. law enforcement or other agencies to take the next step. That was a pretty stunning intelligence lapse, probably one of the biggest intelligence lapses of our time.
I think that to say that we have a no-fault government puts us all in great danger. It's not what you want. You can look at any business and you will see that if you hold the people that work for you accountable, they do a better job. Why wouldn't you want, as the President of the United States, to go, all right, I want every agency reporting here. I want to see what everybody did wrong and I want it fixed. And if there are people that need to be fired, fire them. Why would you not want that?
The best chance to unravel the plot came in San Diego, where hijackers Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi lived for months renting a room from a man who was an FBI informant.
It gets more incredible when you learn these two hijackers were actually living in the home of an FBI informant, somebody who was regularly reporting to the FBI.
Numerous contacts between an FBI informant and two hijackers, Khalid al-Mihdhar and Nawaf al-Hazmi.
Now, this informant was regularly in touch with an FBI agent who's asking him all sorts of questions about what he knows, but he never passes along, or so he has said, never passed along or never had reason to suspect these two Saudi visitors who were renting rooms from him in San Diego.
Told congressional investigators that if headquarters had told him they were already on a government watch list, quoting the agent, it would have made a huge difference. We would have done everything. We would have given them full court press.
Well, and I think when we originally broke the story, I did quote a number of FBI agents, former agents, who wondered about that and wondered if this was really aggressive work by the San Diego FBI office. Why weren't they questioning their informant about who he was living with, who he was renting rooms to?
You know, we always said that if you were at the FAA on the day of September 11th and somehow didn't do your job properly, perhaps you shouldn't be doing that job. You know, perhaps somebody who had a level head, you know, who could operate under severe circumstances like that would be better suited for the job.
It was over a year before 9/11. A Pakistani-British man told the FBI an incredible tale, that he'd been trained by followers of Osama bin Laden to hijack airplanes, and he confessed he was now in America to carry out an attack.
You show up, you say you've been trained by Al-Qaeda to hijack an airplane, and they let you go.
Yes.
So when 9/11 happened, what went through your mind?
Maybe same plan, maybe same training.
NBC News has learned Khan passed not one, but 2 polygraphs. A former FBI official says Newark agents believed him, but word came from headquarters, quote, return him to London and forget about it.
You know, they don't want to have things looked at because they don't want to be, you know, get a slap on the wrist for having done their jobs improperly or worse. I don't think those people should be in those positions then. You know, you should take the good with the bad. You should get accolades for doing a good job, and you should be held accountable for doing a bad job.
They're not worried about accountability. And the big danger is if your leaders are not worried about accountability, they will do dangerous things.
An Army intelligence officer claims that a year before the attacks, his top secret team had identified an al-Qaeda cell operating in the United States that included 9/11 ringleader Mohammed Atta. He says that military lawyers stopped him from sharing that information with the FBI.
We, as through the Able Danger process, discovered 2 of the 3 cells which conducted 9/11 to include Atta.
You are a member of this highly classified military intelligence team known as Able Danger. You identified 4 of the 9/11 hijackers, including Atta. How much of a threat did you think he and his cell were at the time?
Well, it was significant by the fact that we did discover these guys through essentially the advanced developing technology of the time, through pattern analysis. We recognized their linkages and patterns of linkages to the al-Qaeda leadership, and there was a big issue regarding the fact that these foreign nationals were here in the United States doing things which were, in my judgment, questionable based on their linkages to the al-Qaeda leadership.
The Navy captain Scott Philpott is the second military officer to publicly back claims that Abel Danger identified Atta as a security risk. That's someone who had ties to known terrorists.
This is now two different soldiers, two different military people from different branches of the military, one Navy guy, one Army guy, confirming this story that's been out there, that the Abel Danger had identified Atta.
What we were trying to do as good soldiers is we saw a threat. We recognized the fact that they were here in the United States, and we felt we should do something, even when the lawyers said we couldn't.
And when you tried to set up, as I understand it, 3 meetings with the FBI to share this information about the cell, those meetings were blocked by government lawyers. Why?
The lawyers didn't allow us to properly go after, either by intelligence collection or by allowing the FBI to go out to look at these guys because they were here legally.
The 19 hijackers will clear U.S. Customs a total of 33 times. At least 6 will violate immigration laws while living in the United States. And Mohammed Atta, who commanded the operation, is allowed to re-enter the country even though he'd overstayed his previous visa.
There is a right and wrong that's supposed to be going on in our society, and that is when you have a crime, someone pays. When there's a failure, there's accountability. When something goes wrong, you fix it. And none of that has happened.
This was the interview FBI headquarters in Washington feared was coming.
Already had a seat right there.
2 of the FBI's own, Special Agents Robert Wright and John Vincent, breaking ranks.
You can't know the things I know and not go public.
In 1998, al-Qaeda terrorists bombed 2 American embassies in Africa, killing more than 200 people. The agents say some of the money for the attack led back to the people they had been tracking in Chicago and to a powerful Saudi Arabian businessman. This man, Yassin Qadi. 1 month after the attacks, the U.S. government officially identified Yassin al-Qadi as one of Osama bin Laden's important financiers, a specially designated global terrorist, the same man who years earlier, the FBI had ordered agents Vincent and Wright to leave alone.
2 months after the embassies are hit in Africa, they want to shut down the criminal investigation. They wanted to kill it.
Despite the unqualified success of the investigation of the Middle Eastern terrorists, FBI management failed to take seriously the threat of terrorism in the United States. Specifically, FBI management intentionally and repeatedly thwarted and obstructed my attempts to launch a more comprehensive investigation to identify and to neutralize terrorists.
Mark Flessner, now in private practice, says he still can't figure out why Washington stopped the case, whether it was Saudi influence or bureaucratic ineptness.
There were powers bigger than I was in the Justice Department and within the FBI that simply were not going to let it happen, and it didn't happen.
You know what his response was? I think it's just better to let sleeping dogs lie. This is January of 2001.
January 2001. Let sleeping dogs lie.
Those dogs weren't sleeping. They were training, they were getting ready. And there's so much more. God, there's so much more.
You know, this is all bullshit about this, how to protect the United States. We could have protected the United States in 9/11, and we didn't. This is horrific, and people must understand this.
But we've learned that US agents were told to back off from investigating the bin Laden family and the Saudi royals.
This document is marked secret. Case ID 199I WF 213589. WF indicates Washington Field Office special agents were investigating ABL because of its relationship with the World Assembly of Muslim Youth, WAMI, a suspected terrorist organization. ABL is Abdullah bin Laden, president and treasurer of WAMI. On this unremarkable street, at 3411 Silver Maple Place, we located the former home of Abdullah and another brother, Omar, also an FBI suspect. It's conveniently close to Whammy.
The World Assembly of Muslim Youth is in this building, in a little room in the basement at 5613 Leesburg Pike. And here, just a couple blocks down the road at 5913 Leesburg, is where 4 of the hijackers that attacked New York and Washington are listed as having lived.
The FBI did look into Whammy, but for some reason, agents were pulled off the trail.
The FBI wanted to investigate these guys. This is not something that they didn't want to do. They wanted to. They weren't permitted to.
The secret file fell into the hands of national security expert Joe Trento. I received a telephone call from a high-placed member of a U.S. intelligence agency. And he tells me that while there have always been constraints on investigating Saudis, under George Bush, it's gotten much worse. After the elections, the agencies were told to back off investigating the bin Ladens and Saudi royals, and that angered agents.
We pay a lot of money through our taxes for safety, police departments, first responders, and I would hope that the federal government would be looking out for our safety in the way that I define it, but I don't necessarily see that to be true.
July 2001. An FBI agent in Phoenix sends this email to headquarters warning that followers of bin Laden might be attending flight schools in the U.S. No action was taken.
The now famous FBI Phoenix memo from July 2001, warning of a possible coordinated effort by bin Laden to send students to U.S. aviation schools. The report says one person mentioned in that memo turned out to be an associate of hijacker Hani Hanjour. Another in the memo was arrested at an al-Qaeda safe house in Pakistan last year.
How in the world could somebody have read this document and not had lights, firecrackers, rockets go off in their head that this is something that is really important?
I mean, it's not just about, you know, holding them accountable so that you could fire somebody. How do I know that today? If we were in a terrible situation, they would know what to do. You know, why wouldn't we want to go back and retrain them?
Then in August 2001, Zacharias Moussaoui, later accused of being the 20th hijacker, is arrested after behaving strangely at a flight school in Minnesota.
A Moroccan who was training at this Minnesota flight center has been arrested, having aroused suspicions after telling instructors he only wanted to learn how to steer a plane, not how to land or take off.
Somebody showing up at a 747, a professional flight school, and saying, I just want to learn how to fly horizontal is absurd in the extreme.
Minneapolis agent Colleen Raleigh accusing FBI headquarters of hampering efforts to get a search warrant for the computer of Zacharias Moussaoui, the so-called 20th hijacker.
An FBI agent jots down a chilling note.
The agent mentioned the possibility of Moussaoui being that type of person that could fly something into the World Trade Center.
These were not cryptic things. These were a couple of things that should have been more apparent to the intelligence agencies. These were leads that were not adequately pursued.
As far as I'm concerned, 9/11 didn't happen in a bubble. It happened over a long time with people not making the right choices and not making the right decisions, allowing certain things to be ignored, closing a blind eye to other things in the course of doing business and keeping constituents and foreign nationals happy. Anyone that allowed decisions to be made that would ultimately harm the citizens of this country should be held to account.
There was no real investigative reporting going on with unanswered questions. Those kind of just got dead-ended. At a certain point, we, the families, some of us who had the strength to get up and go to Washington, began a quest to change that.
We wanted a commission that was going to be independent, nothing to do with the government, because we were going to have to investigate the government. They're the agencies that failed on 9/11 across the board. Massive failures. So we needed a commission that was outside the scope of the government, with investigative powers, with subpoena powers, with all the powers that would be available in a criminal court, with accountability.
There were failures everywhere on September 11th. There was not just intelligence failures. There were failures of the FAA, of NORAD, the military, failures of, you know, you just name it, across the board, wherever you wanted to look in the government, there were failures.
They might need to be pushed, because no one wants to admit failures. We know our government. They don't like to tell you, admit to mistakes. But with a little bit pushing, we felt that officials would come forward, tell their stories about what happened, where they were, and let's fix these problems. We don't ever want this to happen again. And I mean, what is wrong with that? Nothing.
We basically started with all the questions. The other family members, like Monica had stuff regarding fire safety and evacuation procedures in the buildings, those kinds of things. But the four of us basically had the bulk of questions with which we were able to, actually we produced 4 huge binders of information and backup for our questions, and we carried them around Washington, D.C.
We were fortunate that we found a core group of very bright, strong people willing to do what was necessary to get some answers.
And there were 12 of us, and again, from all different political leanings.
Tap dance, acrobatics, we had to go to Washington a lot. We had to make phone calls, we had to figure out how to speak to the press, we had to, we had to do a lot to get this investigation.
We went door to door in Congress and the Senate and got told, don't worry about it, they're going to do their own hearings. You know what, the agencies will investigate themselves, they'll have their own internal reports.
It's absolutely amazing what you can do when you really have a mission and you have a drive that pushes you. You don't have to worry about what you say, because what you say comes from the heart. What you say is true. What's to be nervous about? Making an ass of yourself? Who cares? Nothing's worse than what we've been through.
They could come up with a question that would, I think they were hoping to off-put us on an investigation, and that we could come back with, information to back up our point, and then they would be left there sitting at a table with us and not know what to say next to us. The silence was deafening. If you don't know the answers to why they failed here, there, and everywhere, and we have all this information to prove that, what are you going to say in your defense that could thwart an investigation?
Any commission you set up is immediately going to have to go into button-down mode. Most of what we need to talk about here should not be talked about in open hearings.
There were attempts on the part of the administration to stop this investigation from happening. They did not want this investigation to happen. Why? I don't understand it. I do not understand how President Bush didn't say, I was in office for 8 months. I don't know what these agencies were doing. I don't know why we fell down on the job. Let me see everything. I will never understand that.
The United States military was defeated by 19 hijackers, 4 of our own airplanes, $400,000. Why wouldn't the president have turned around and said, heads should roll? What happened here?
If he had done everything in his power, if there was nothing to hide, he should have been able to, be our biggest advocate.
President Bush had at first opposed any independent commission, but he reversed himself under pressure from the families of 9/11 victims.
I think that the ultimate success came about because you really could not sustain the argument that you didn't need an investigation. That was an unsustainable argument.
I will never understand why it took us a year to fight for something that only makes good sense. You fail, you want to find out what you did wrong, and you want to fix it.
What we found in every area where we needed to investigate, information was reclassified or classified as secret.
Terry? It does seem that across the board on proving that these charitable organizations, non-governmental organizations, banks have links to terror, on proving that bin Laden is behind these acts, on what plans the administration has post whatever movement we make in Afghanistan, the answer is always, that's classified, trust us. Does that really serve the democracy well if all this information on which the government is basing its actions is classified?
The classification of for national security is based on sources and methods. And when you're doing an investigation where the attacks have already occurred, there are 3,000 people dead, and you're investigating the agencies and the people that were at their deaths on 9/11 and where those investigations lead, very little, if any, has to do with sources and methods and letting any kind of secrets out.
First, let me condition the press this way. Any sources and methods of intelligence will remain guarded in secret. My administration will not talk about how we gather intelligence, if we gather intelligence, and what the intelligence says.
National security was already compromised. People are dead, and in order to get to the truth, you need to have certain information.
The joint inquiry tried to do a better job. You know, they did try. They did not get access to the August 6th PDB.
It took us 9 months to do all of our work, have our hearings, interview our witnesses, write the report, and it took 6 months for the administration to agree to some level of declassification. The report is overclassified. That is a disservice to the American people.
There are just pages of blank here that the committee's left out.
Most of that information is classified, I think overly classified. I believe the American people should know the extent of the challenge that we face.
One question: what did President Bush know about the threat? The committee was denied access to any intelligence information shared with the president. The only evidence provided was a description of a so-called PDB, a presidential daily briefing about the danger of an attack that was dated August 6, 2001.
This was held back for reasons of national security, and national security is just supposed to be keeping sources and methods secret. Now, this I don't think is the whole, you know, PDB from August 6th, 2001 either. But it's a couple of pages. But just in these couple of pages, there's only a few redactions. I mean, there weren't sources and methods for the most part. It seems to me that this should have been and could have been released to the joint inquiry.
There's a lot of stuff in here, but there's a lot of information that's not in here that should be, in my judgment.
And then listen, even after the investigation, there was stonewalling from the agencies when they went asking for information.
It is a critical time for the Commission. We've worked hard to stay on schedule, to complete our work by May 4. The coming weeks will determine whether we're able to do our job within time allotted. Time slipping by, extensive and prompt cooperation from the U.S. government, the Congress, state, local agencies is essential. This report offers an initial evaluation of the cooperation. The problems that have arisen so far with the Department of Defense are becoming particularly serious. Governor Kaine saying he can't get information from NORAD, from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, from the Defense Department. Will you take steps so that you will cooperate fully with Governor Kaine immediately so his commission can do their work
we've already taken steps to try to accelerate it. We have no, we want to cooperate fully with the commission.
And you will? Absolutely.
And we had a commission who, we had asked them to subpoena often and early. You know, they did not believe in that. Tom Kane believed that a softer hand would rule the day.
For an independent operational look at why 9/11 happened, what happened there, when what the president and the government knew, and when they knew it.
What's their argument? The White House. Why won't they let you see this? What do they say?
They don't want any more eyeballs to see their documents than they can possibly get away with.
The subpoena power that we fought for was never used because we were told we don't want to start a fight because then it'll drag out in the courts. Nice makes better, not to worry.
This was the only investigation we were ever going to have. It was our prosecution. So to be handled with kid gloves felt wrong. And that's how we felt that they were handling the agencies.
As you look over my shoulder and look directly across the old executive office building, you can see there are still these huge clouds of smoke billowing out of the Pentagon.
Early on, there were articles that talked about the FBI confiscating tapes from a gas station, from a hotel, that could see what happened that day. You know, they're pointed towards the Pentagon.
From the Nexcom gas station, from the traffic cams, we believe there was video taken of that plane crash. From the Sheraton Hotel that overlooks the Pentagon, I believe there's video from that. And we asked that they please subpoena for that video, because the only video that was ever released to the public of the Pentagon crash came out 6 months after September 11th. So we asked them to please look into that and subpoena this evidence for us, because this is our only investigation and we feel that all the evidence should be subpoenaed.
Now, every time we would ask them about those tapes, you had 3 people rolling their eyes and saying, oh, here's Miss Conspiracy. She doesn't think a plane went into the building. But really, it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with, hey, there is, you know, information out there that you could possibly have. Why not get it?
They did not subpoena for this Pentagon videos. All they did was put in document requests, and document requests do not need to be answered.
Even if they had said we investigated and there was no tapes, the tapes didn't exist. But it wasn't, it was just they put the document request down and they didn't get it. I mean, it made you very unsure of, you know, the commission's report and that they were getting all the information that you needed.
So there's evidence that just never got even seen.
There was a point where Sibel Edmonds, the FBI translator, whose case has been in the media since this time.
And the same thing happened with her and the 9/11 Commission. It wasn't until we walked her in there that they even saw her.
You know, there was no attempt on their part to try and dig deep to get the real story. Now, that was a story that's incredible to me to this day.
A former FBI wiretap translator with top secret security clearance. She was hired just after September 11th to go back and retranslate, or sometimes translate for the first time, documents and conversations from before September 11th.
Within a few weeks after I started working there, I came across some really serious issues. From security breaches to certain documents from pre-9/11 and also post-9/11 that were being either intentionally blocked or mistranslated, and also some really significant security breaches that have been already confirmed by the Senate Judiciary Committee.
We had met with Sibel, and she had told us of her story and how she was fired.
Sibel Edmonds was fired this past March. The FBI offered no explanation, saying in a letter only that her contract was terminated completely for the government's convenience.
She had a good piece of what happened on 9/11 and why it didn't, and you know, it was not thwarted. The attacks were not thwarted.
She recently testified before the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks upon the United States, saying that the FBI had detailed information prior to September 11, 2001, that a terrorist attack involving airplanes was being plotted.
There were many investigations before September 11 that had, again, specific information. However, we never get to hear these because they're classified and they are withholding right now based on state secret privilege and based on sensitive diplomatic relations.
Now, Sybil Edmonds, to call Condoleezza Rice's claim that the White House had no specific information on domestic threat or one involving planes an outrageous lie is very strong. Can you repeat again or fill out the information that you have to substantiate that?
Well, Amy, I really wish I could come and I could have given you some specific information. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but Attorney General Ashcroft on October 18, 2002, personally asserted state secret privilege in my case.
I had a gag order put on her, the information that she wanted to tell the American people, using an obscure legal statute called state secret privilege.
How often has state secrets privilege been exercised by our government?
They call it a neutron bomb of all privileges. It's even higher than executive privilege. And very, very rarely, I guess some people with legal knowledge can answer that less than 5-6 times throughout the history of the United States. And usually for very high-level CIA undercover agents or military, very, very sensitive military operation. As far as I know, it has never been asserted for a translator such as myself.
And we had gone to a lot of, to whoever we knew in the media to bring out her story. And you know what? So many of them had said, oh, it sounds conspiratorial, it sounds like she had a beef. You know, bottom line, 6 months later when, you know, there was reports that came out that said, well, even the FBI had to admit that her story was true, you know, they turn around and look at you and say, oh, well.
She has a multitude of federal agents backing up her claims.
Did she seem credible to you? Did her story seem credible?
Absolutely, she's credible. And the reason I feel she's very credible is because people within the FBI have corroborated a lot of her story.
And there's so much that the public just simply doesn't know about what went wrong, what we had, and my last hope right now is this commission. 9/11 Commission is my last hope because I have pursued all possible authority channels that I could have pursued.
Now then they recorded her information and it never made it into the 9/11 Commission report.
There's more CYA going on in there than actual national security. It's political security, not national security. I look at national security as the security of the American citizens, not necessarily the security of a particular administration that's in power or an administration that's no longer in power. That to me is not national security.
President Bush was regularly told by the Director of Central Intelligence that there was an urgent threat. On one occasion, he was told this dozens of times in the morning briefings that George Tenet gave him. I do know he was thereafter continually informed about the threat by George Tenet.
You have thousands of pieces of information, car bombs and this method and that method, and you have to depend to a certain degree on the intelligence agencies to sort, to tell you what is actually relevant, what is actually based on sound sources.
I remember this minute vividly. Tenet was taking a lot of heat. And then finally he said to everyone,
look, by the spring and summer, everybody was seized with the urgency of this nature by virtue of what I was telling them.
You know, of course, during the summer, people talked about how his hair was on fire, so much information was coming in. But he finally just said to commissioners, this was his final statement in his testimony, he said, look, there's just so much information I can give the administration. He says, I cannot make policy. And he left it at that.
So this period of time saw an enormous amount of activity, typical to the kind of activity we saw in previous threat periods. And all I can tell you is the policymakers got it, because I talked to all of them about it, and they understood the nature of what we were dealing with.
He wasn't blaming people, but he said, we gave him all this information.
This report is prepared for the president by the FBI, by the CIA, you know, in conjunction, and given to the president so that he can review the threats to our national security and do something about them. The president had a lot of information about what bin Laden was planning to do in the United States. That's number one. This was on August 6, 2001, which was a month before the September 11th attacks. He was being warned by our intelligence agencies. The intelligence agencies didn't fail in this. They told him what to look for. And then he didn't act on it. There was nobody tasked to do anything about this information.
Christmas 1999. The world prepares for the coming of a new millennium. The counterterrorism warriors fear the enemy will use the occasion as a symbolic moment to inflict Armageddon on the infidels.
What had happened was that on December 14th, 1999, an Algerian man coming across the U.S.-Canadian border near Seattle was caught with 100 pounds of explosives and timing devices and confessed to a plot to bomb the Los Angeles airport.
The CIA was instructed to go out to all their sources overseas and pump them again, just squeeze until, you know, the pits popped out of their sources for any information. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was instructed to activate all its wiretaps domestically that were related to terrorism investigations.
From the plan to blow up the Los Angeles airport, another trail led from Boston to a planned attack in Jordan. There were other conspirators in Seattle, Brooklyn, and Manhattan.
Arrests were made that had they not been uncovered, the plot had not been uncovered and those arrests made, we could have had horrific tragedies around the millennium.
The key thing during this period is that the mobilization was managed at the White House.
The 9/11 report in Chapter 8 says that in the summer of 2001, the government ignored repeated warnings by the CIA, ignored, and didn't do anything to harden our border security, didn't do anything to harden airport security, didn't do anything to engage local law enforcement, didn't do anything to round up INS and consular offices and say we have to shut this down, and didn't warn the American people.
If the damn administration would have said, hey, let's start doing something. Let's start being diligent at the entrance of the airport. We have all these warnings.
Commissioner Tim Romer asked Giuliani if he had gotten this information from the federal government. There's information in here that says New York is a target. Why wasn't Giuliani given this information? That should have been a huge story.
The famous presidential daily briefing on August 6th, we say in the report that the briefing officers believed that there was a considerable sense of urgency and it was current. So there's a case that could be made that wasn't made.
Just the mere fact that you had an intelligence community with its hair on fire, so much so that you had FAA warnings, so much so that you had a July 5th meeting with Condoleezza Rice, Richard Clark, and all the heads of the FAA and the intelligence community. Why would you have not done anything? Why would you have tasked nobody to do anything, to strengthen any of our protocols at any port, at any place? You know, they did nothing.
But what we've continued to hear from this administration is that the threat was much too diffuse. There was no way you could zero in on the fact that Al-Qaeda was going to use jets as bombs and ram them into buildings.
That is a straw man.
We knew that they were people who might try a hijacking, but, you know, again, that terrorism and hijacking might be associated is not rocket science.
Well, what I really never understood about the argument of that, you know, we never suspected that planes could be used as weapons is, did we not have any protocol for just a regular emergency? Why were we looking at this as important to the fact that they eventually used the planes as missiles? What happens if it was a regular hijacking? Why didn't we follow those protocols?
All of this reporting about hijacking was about traditional hijacking. You take a plane, people were worried they might blow one up, but they were mostly worried that they might try to take a plane and use it for release of the blind sheikh or some of their own people.
Every time that they prefaced a question with, well, we didn't know planes could be used as missiles, they were throwing you off course by saying, well, we didn't have a particular protocol for that. But there were protocols already out there for emergencies that we did not follow.
As Bob Curry said on Paul Zahn show on November 8th, go to chapter 8. All the information was there. George Bush, the administration, did nothing. Absolutely nothing to warn anyone and to stop these attacks.
We knew he had designs on us. We knew he hated us. But there was nobody in our government, at least, and I don't think the prior government, that could envision flying airplanes into buildings on such a massive scale.
Mr. President, you don't need to know that. This is an Islamic jihadist movement that's been organized since the early 1990s, but declared war in the United States twice, in 96 and 98. You knew they were in the United States. You were warned by the CIA. You knew in July they were inside the United States. You were told again by briefing officers in August that it was a dire threat. And what did you do? Nothing, so far as we could see in the 9/11 Commission. Now, that's in the report.
I am very upset about Condoleezza Rice because her job was National Security Advisor. And it doesn't appear that she understood what that meant when she went into the job.
I remember very well that the president was aware that there were issues inside the United States. He talked to people about this, but I don't remember the Al-Qaeda cells as being something that we were told we needed to do something about.
Isn't it? At what point did she not understand that it was her job to investigate what was going on there? She was in charge of our national security when this took place and doesn't seem to have answered for anything.
I really don't remember, Commissioner, whether I discussed this with the president.
Thank you. I have to say, with the laundry list of questions that Commissioner Lehman asked her, she said she didn't know a lot of things, and I would question what exactly did she know. And if she didn't know it, then who else would know it?
Dick Clark had told me, I think in a memorandum, I remember it as being only a line or two, that there were Al-Qaeda cells in the United States. Now, the question is, what did we need to do about that?
In the memo, Clark declares an urgent need that the principals, the heads of the CIA, FBI, State, and Defense Departments, meet to be briefed on the Al-Qaeda threat.
On August 6th, after having all the warnings that they had, after having the FAA put out their circulars, after getting a PDB that said bin Laden was determined to strike in the United States, she did not feel it was time to call a principals meeting.
Clark was the president's top advisor on terrorism. And yet, it wasn't until 9/11 that he ever got to brief Mr. Bush on the subject.
I do not understand how we can allow that to just go. How we don't turn around and say, hey, you know what? You didn't know your job. You failed. And so you can't have it anymore. Now she got a better job.
This massive and often gripping report by the 9/11 Commission concludes that terrorists, quote, exploited deep institutional failings within our government. But it's careful to avoid blaming anyone for failing to prevent the attacks. The commissioners say right up front that their purpose was not to assign individual blame, but to provide the fullest possible account of the events surrounding what happened that day.
In the end, do you think your question was answered tonight about your frustration that there seemed to be a lack of accountability in this report? Commission member Slate Gorton shot back and said, look, this isn't about playing the blame game.
For the first time, Commission Chairman Tom Kean is saying publicly that 9/11 could have and should have been prevented.
I do not believe it had to happen.
Appointed by President Bush, Kean is now pointing fingers inside the administration and laying blame.
Do you think someone or someone's should have been fired? There were people, certainly, if I was doing a job, who would certainly not be in a position that they were in at that time, because they failed. They simply failed.
Today, we don't know whether the same people who were sitting in the decision-making spots on that critical day are still in those positions.
That's correct.
Shouldn't we at least know whether...
Yes. Answer is yes. And we will.
It's such a disappointment. Such a disappointment, because we met with them when the commission was being formed, and they so assured us that they understood our pain. And they knew that they had to fix the problem, and they knew that the future safety of the citizens of this country was at stake, and trust them, they were going to do the best job possible.
With 9/11 happening and 3,000 people dying, there should be accountability there. You can't just say nothing happens as a result of 3,000 people dying and mistakes being made at the CIA and the FBI. The American people deserve that accountability, and it also means that they'll trust the government more if we are accountable and we hold people accountable and we ask the tough questions and we follow the facts wherever they lead.
The commission's report said everybody is at fault, so no one is at fault. That fixes nothing. And the risk there is that when it happens next time and they turn around and they say to you, well, everybody was at fault, nobody was at fault, how many times can they get away with saying that? That's what I really want to know.
Among the things that the commission cites is, quote, the failure of imagination as the most important reason that the U.S. was unprepared for 9/11.
9/11 was a failure of imagination? That's outrageous. 9/11 was a failure of people to do their job.
Reading it, your first impression could be that the attacks were indeed inevitable and could not have been prevented. But in effect, this is to blame everybody in sight, and at the same time, no one. Read the report more closely, and you're forced to ask, did the system fail, or the people who take an oath to make it work?
That's what the book was about. They put all these facts on the table, right? Not all the facts, not most of the facts, but they did put, so it's up to the people to interpret them. But they never came out and said that. Well, how many people do you think read the 9/11 book in its entirety and then did research on it? Not many people.
And we took an oath not to talk about during the campaign, I think correctly so, to increase the capacity of that commission's report to be heard by the People's Congress.
The commissioners made a decision collectively, apparently, to keep silent about any issues that they disagreed about and to keep silent about any areas of accountability prior to the election.
On World News Tonight, John Kerry concedes.
President Bush must now finish the war he began. Don't expect big changes in strategy.
Well, the 9/11 report says in Chapter 8, now it's beyond the campaign, so the promise I had to keep this out of the campaign is over.
The problem with it is that you're not telling the truth. You're not allowing people to see the whole truth. And when you have a commissioner such as Bob Kerry go on, go on a television program after the election and say that he feels that the administration had responsibility and some accountability for the failures that took place on 9/11, it's too late. It's too late to have that affect any change. And then doesn't that make him complicit in a system that is failing us? Stephen Hadley, who was responsible, or so they said, for putting the 16 words into the State of the Union that caused us to go to war in Iraq, he was forgiven, and then he was given the job of National Security Advisor. I don't know, what does that say? What question does that bring to your mind when people who have failed are given promotions.
One of our most, hated days was when they came out and said that everyone's to blame, therefore no one's to blame. We thought that everyone's to blame, therefore everyone's to blame. And that if it rose to the level of negligence or criminal negligence, that those people should have been held accountable and been punished for it. Certainly they should not still be in their jobs. Certainly if somebody perjured themselves in front of a commission by holding up their right hand and then not telling the truth, they should have been charged with perjury. There is no excuse in what we hold to be dearest about America for what has gone on here. There is no excuse, and we are all less safe because of the way this has been handled.
And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
I want him held. I want justice. And there's an old poster out west, as I recall, that said "Wanted, dead or alive."
I felt that, geez, this is probably the first time in history that we had the whole world on our side. So I said, what a great opportunity it is to find this one man, get into the causes. Here's this, 19 supposedly hijackers and Osama bin Laden. And there's no way in the world we wouldn't be able to catch that because everyone in the world was on our side, including the Taliban. The Taliban would have given him up.
CBS News correspondent Alan Pizzi has learned of a heretofore secret meeting between U.S. representatives and the Taliban in a hotel in Quetta, Afghanistan.
4 days after the attacks, 5 Americans checked into this hotel in one of the most potentially dangerous cities in Pakistan. Hotel records show they were booked in as U.S. Embassy employees. CBS has covered their names to protect their identities, but at least one was a military officer. The following day, 2 Afghanis checked in as Afghan Embassy employees. Taliban sources say one of them was a Taliban military commander. CBS News has met with an Afghan-American businessman who described himself as a middleman and says he attended a meeting on September 16th between the U.S. and Taliban officials in the hotel in Quetta.
I was very encouraged by the United States official.
Mohabbat said the Americans presented 3 demands: hand over Osama bin Laden, extradite foreigners in bin Laden's organization wanted in their home countries, and shut down bin Laden's bases and camps.
So when he went into Afghanistan, I said, this is all bull. I said, they're doing it for one reason. It's all politics, and they could care less, and it's been proven. They could care less about bin Laden. They didn't care about truth. They didn't care about justice.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
And the goal right now is to try to bring down al-Qaeda and to try to bring down the Taliban who support them.
There's some reports that you've made some progress in pinpointing the location of Osama bin Laden. In fact, reported in Newsweek this morning says that intelligence sources say it's been narrowed down to a 20-mile by 20-mile sector in Afghanistan.
The commander says the al-Qaeda streaming towards the border are leaving to the Afghan village called Suleiman Kaya. 300 Afghan warriors, supported by American Special Forces, are in pursuit.
Secretary, could you first address the reports today that some in the government have come to the conclusion that bin Laden was present in Tora Bora at the time of the battles there in early December, that he got away, and that this represented a failure by General Franks not to take the initiative?
Well, first, I know, I knew of, nor do I know today of any evidence that he was in Tora Bora at the time, or that he left Tora Bora at the time, or even where he is today.
There's no question in my mind they could have picked up bin Laden any day of the week. It would have been wonderful. Can you imagine a trial in the United States with bin Laden, the information that we would get from bin Laden? But it's quite obvious they don't want this information to reach the public. So that's why we'll never see a trial of anyone.
Well, there were trials in Germany.
Yes.
Mazzoudi and Metasadek were tried, but they both walked because our government didn't turn over information that the German government needed to prosecute them.
The only person so far convicted in the 9/11 attacks was released from a German prison today. Munir Mota-Sadek had been found guilty of accessory to murder, but a German court threw out the conviction, saying he was denied a fair trial because the United States would not allow his lawyer to question a terror suspect in U.S. custody.
So not only have we not brought anyone to trial here in connection with any kind of terrorism, whether related to 9/11 or anything else, or accomplices to the plotters, we have actually not cooperated with foreign countries who have brought people to trial.
It's ridiculous. I mean, I don't really understand it at all. You know, I don't understand why they didn't cooperate with the German government. I don't understand how our national security could be compromised by cooperating in a trial where you're trying to try a terrorist who's threatening our national security. It's a conundrum. I mean, they have you going around in circles with their reasoning.
All the polls show that people are ready to fight this thing through. I think it'll become difficult after assuming we get Osama bin Laden. Once you get Osama bin Laden, either he's captured or more likely he's killed, then I think there'll be much less willingness on the part of the public to take casualties for more broader, perhaps more amorphous goals.
Our objective is more than bin Laden. You know, again, I don't know where he is. I repeat what I said. I truly am not that concerned about him. I am deeply concerned about Iraq. And so should the American people be concerned about Iraq. And so should people who love freedom be concerned about Iraq.
President Bush is launching a new campaign to win support for a new war against Iraq.
The war on terror, you can't distinguish between Al-Qaeda and Saddam when you talk about the war on terror. This is a man who, in my judgment, would like to use Al-Qaeda as a forward army. Secretly and without fingerprints, he could provide one of his hidden weapons to terrorists or help them develop their own. My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger. Gosh, I don't think I ever said I'm not worried about Osama bin Laden. That's kind of one of those exaggerations.
The Iraq War, you know, you look at WMDs and whether or not they existed, tying the Iraq War to 9/11. We know 9/11 had nothing to, Iraq had nothing to do with September 11th.
Do we have any evidence linking Saddam Hussein or Iraqis to this operation?
No. We've had no evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved with the September the 11th. I don't think we ever said, at least I know I didn't say, that there was a direct connection between September the 11th and Saddam Hussein. I was very careful never to say that Saddam Hussein ordered the attacks on America.
And yet the media, the president, George Tenet, I mean, everybody, Colin Powell made us think that somehow 9/11 in Iraq was connected and we had to, preemptively strike Iraq because of September 11th. That's really terrible. Why are we in Iraq? If it's not for WMDs and it's not because Iraq had something to do with 9/11, why are we there?
Back in 1997, a group of Washington heavyweights, almost all of them neoconservatives, formed an organization called the Project for the New American Century.
Inside this building, behind this door, is the brain trust that some suspect has led the U.S. to the brink of war.
Included Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, Robert Zoellick, John Bolton.
10 are now in the Bush administration. The letter to Mr. Clinton was, in essence, a preview of arguments that would have a more receptive audience 5 years later. That letter argued the case for a comprehensive political and military strategy for bringing down Saddam and his regime. A 76-page white paper circulating for a year and arguing for an aggressive U.S. foreign policy suddenly gained new relevance. In the blueprint, it says the process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. Was 9/11 your Pearl Harbor?
I think it was the country's Pearl Harbor. I think it was the president's Pearl Harbor.
Barely 5 hours after American Airlines Flight 77 plowed into the Pentagon, the Secretary of Defense was telling his aides to start thinking about striking Iraq. And at 2:40, the notes quote him as saying he wanted best info fast. Judge whether good enough to hit SH, meaning Saddam Hussein. At the same time, not only UBL, the initials used to identify Osama bin Laden. Go massive, the notes quote him as saying, sweep it all up, things related and not.
The project has a vision beyond a regime change in Iraq, a vision in which the United States government inserts itself in other failed regimes in the Middle East. So this truly does become a new American century.
How will we know when this war is won? Vice President Cheney says it might not end in our lifetime.
I think that may be correct. I think this is going to be a long, hard-fought conflict, and it will be global in scale. And it won't be, as I mentioned earlier, it won't be just military. It's going to be all the instruments of our national power with our friends and allies. And the fact that it could last several years or many years, or maybe our lifetimes, would not surprise me.
You know, I've really come to hate that word closure. I don't think you ever get real closure on any of this stuff. My husband's gone, and, you know, and I don't really know exactly what happened to him. You know, I don't know how long he lived after the building was hit, and I don't know how he died. You know, that's really hard for anybody. Even this, you know, almost 4 years later, 3.5 years later, it's still very hurtful.
You know, mine is a simple life. God knows what this man would have done. He was 26 years old, and where he was going was phenomenal. And I want the world to know what they lost. And I'm not, and you know, there's a lot of great people that were lost in this.
You know, I feel that on September 11th, I lost my husband, but I also lost my country. I mean, you know, that's how it feels to me. And there was, you know, it was two separate issues, and you had to grieve for each of them separately. I don't like what I have learned in the last few years. And, you know, it's something that I'm sure that many people were aware of, you know, and it took a tragedy, unfortunately, for me to get my head out of the sand. We don't always do things for the right reasons. We do not make sure that the public has the truth. Our representatives don't always represent.
Almost 4 years post 9/11, rather than feeling more comfortable with where we are, I am actually more frightened. The changes that have occurred in these last 4 years in the name of my murdered husband, in the name of the war on terror, in the name of spreading democracy around the world, has gone unchecked by our media. We are lied to by our government. We are pushed into wars on false evidence. Innocent kids are dying every day. I fear where we'll be in a short time, because it only took us a short time to get here.
Raising children in America right now, with all these wars going on, is scary. Watching the media fall down and not do its job, knowing that we're unprotected even by the people whose best interests would be served, because they're Americans too. They're not doing their job to protect their own families and themselves. They're very short-sighted. because maybe they're getting a paycheck by doing it how they're doing it, but they're not protecting America and what America is supposed to be. I guess I would hope that the official story would be the true story at the end of the day, that the public would know what really happened on September 11th for our own good and our own, national security, which may be a different definition than the administration has for us with national security. Our founding fathers would probably be appalled at how this whole event has been handled and how much effort it took to get any questions even asked, let alone answered.
For 3 years, we were tireless. We were running to Washington and knocking down doors, and the truth is, it takes that kind of commitment and dedication in order to see anything happen. A lot of times we've said, look, democracy can work. We were 12 people, we got them to do an investigation, but it was 24 hours a day. It's that kind of commitment, that 24-hour-a-day commitment that you need to see anything happen, and that's really hard. It's really hard to do that 100% of the time.
It's like being in a car game. Howard Zinn said, well, if you fold your hand every play, you're going to always lose. You have no hope of winning. So I have to stay in the game, and it's just put myself out in the public. I love going to high schools, talking to high school kids, and I will tell them what's happening to this world, what the danger is and what happened before 9/11. So you just have to, it's like that seed. You have to plant the seed. You have to believe that your word means something. And then the cumulative, maybe it won't happen, but if it happens 50 years down the road, great.
My hope is that there are people out there, whistleblowers, people with information, people who know things, who are having a real hard time sleeping, hopefully more hard time than I'm having, that feel a moral obligation to do the right thing, to come forward, to help us, help those in power really fix the problems.
We still would probably like to address our unanswered questions. It's a Herculean effort again, which doesn't mean we won't. It just means we haven't garnered the strength yet to do it.
I don't know when we're going to learn the whole truth, because we need to re-energize in order to go back out there, in order to ask for another investigation, ask for more truths, and that's huge.
The more people that are out there doing that, helping us look at this, the better it is for America and how we define America and have always defined America.
You have to hope, because that's the only thing that you have left. But is it realistic? I don't know. I think this is going to be one of those things that where for 25 years, it's going to be sitting until the archives open up and you start to see what was put in, what information was put in there by the National Commission, by the City of New York. And, people will do it, because if I'm not here to do it, my kids will. There will always be burning questions.
And it's going to happen here again. And for shame on everyone who did not step up to the plate. For shame on everyone who took to heart the myth of hero worship and flag waving, because it's better to wave a flag than ask your government for accountability. For shame when the next attack occurs and the next group of victims lie in a pool of blood. And for shame when the next families of the victims have to start pounding on the doors of our Congress and our Senate for another investigation.
And it's part of my son's legacy. Knowledge is power. Until people get the knowledge straight, then they will never, ever, ever have any power in their life. And that's what I feel.